Okay, welcome back. That last video I'm going to be calling 203 human 1. This will be 203 human 2. And this is a fairly short chapter, so this should be the only other video we need for this chapter. Okay, body cavities and membranes. A bunch of body cavities. We're going to look at the posterior and anterior cavity. So posterior back here, anterior cavity here. The posterior cavity, the cranial cavity and vertebral canal. The anterior cavity has a thoracic cavity, which consists of two pleural cavities and a pericardial cavity. And then the abdominal pelvic category, which are abdominal and pelvic. And it's really, there's no really delineation between abdominal and pelvic cavities. There are delineations, membranes that separate the pleural cavities from the pericardial cavities and the thoracic cavity, but I'm going to show you that in the next slide. In every membrane in the body, all these cavities are lined by a membrane, a simple squamous epithelium that's serous. That means it secretes this watery fluid, right, that allows organs to move in these cavities without sticking to each other. And there's two, in every one of these categories, there's two simple squamous epithelium. One lines the cavity itself, called the parietal, and there's a simple squamous epithelium lining the organs in the cavity, and that's always called the visceral. For example, the heart is in the pericardial cavity. There's a parietal pericardium that lines the pericardial cavity, and visceral pericardium that is over the surface of the heart that's in the pericardial cavity. All right, so let me show you, because this is right out of the book. This figure here, showing should say a posterior cavity. I don't know why I call this a posterior aspect. Posterior cavity, cranial cavity where the brain is, vertebral canal where the spinal cord is. Then ventral cavity, thoracic cavity, abdominal pelvic. In the thoracic, two pleural cavities and on both sides a pericardial cavity. Then the abdominal pelvic category is abdominal cavity where most of the digestive organs are, and the pelvic cavity where more excretory and reproductive organs are. Okay. And it's still really line. It's showed in pink and the abdominal cavity in red, but there's no real delineation between them. There is a delineation between thoracic and between thoracic cavity and abdominal pelvic cavity, and that's a diaphragm. So there's a muscular boundary between those two cavities. All right. Okay, then we get into feedback mechanisms. These are critical to understand because when we get into physiology, physiology is regulation. How do you regulate things? Right? There's all kinds of what I call homeostatic variables. That is, everything inside your body is variable, but homeostatic ones are the ones that should be kept constant or nearly constant for your whole life. Body temperature is a great example. It stays within about a half a degree over the course of a day, only varies a little bit. We're going to look at blood glucose concentration. That's a homeostatic variable. Blood pH, when we get into pH, that's a homeostatic variable. Blood osmolarity, homeostatic variable. So all kinds of homeostatic variables that have to be regulated. And so we're going to get into so it's regulatory. Negative feedback is the essence of regulation. And we're going to look at the components of a negative feedback system. And as I said, blood pressure is one, body temperature is one, as I mentioned, and blood pressure are examples. of things that are regulated with a negative feedback system. Then there's positive feedback mechanisms. These are not regulatory, these are protective. They are rapid response. Something has to be done very rapidly. And so examples are immune function, blood clotting, and labor are what are called positive feedback mechanisms. There's only a few of them compared to negative feedback mechanisms. Okay, components. Negative feedback mechanism right here. There's a stimulus, change in a variable that is regulated, for example, body temperature, stretch, and muscle. It is changing for some reason. You go on a really cold day, your body temperature starts to drop. You go on a really hot day, body temperature starts to go up. So there are receptors that detect this change in this homeostatic variable. So thermoreceptors in your brain and in the periphery are going to detect the change in body temperature. They send information to a control center. Input information to the control center, and those are usually separate structures, but not always. Control center is oftentimes, in a lot of negative feedback mechanisms, the brain. And this integrates input, initiates change, figures out what to do, and, integrates, which is a fancy word for adding together the inputs and figuring out what to do. It figures out what to do, sends out information, output information to an effector. An effector is going to make a change in the opposite direction from where this homeostatic variable was something to drift. That's why it's called negative feedback. If your body temperature gets too low, you have to find mechanisms to raise your body temperature. Body temperature gets too high, you have to elicit mechanisms to lower the body temperature, always in the opposite direction from where it's drifting. That's why it's called negative. And effectors are often muscles or glands. Right? So homeostatic control mechanism. Here is a positive feedback mechanism. It didn't mention it, but breastfeeding is a positive feedback mechanism. Baby suckles the breast. Sensory receptors in the skin of the breast detect the sucklings and impulses to hypothalamus, which is in the brain, and that's where the control center is. Hypothalamus signals posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin released in the blood stimulates milk ejection from the breast. Milk is released, and the more the baby sucks, the more oxytocin is produced, the more milk is produced. Okay. Once the baby stops suckling, that stimulation is gone, the oxytocin production is removed. Labor so it's a couple more of these positive feedback mechanisms in females. Labor is the same way. The baby's head pushing against the cervix causes the hypothalamus to release the same thing, oxytocin. Oxytocin travels to the uterus and causes contraction of the smooth muscle of the uterus. That causes the baby's head to be pushed harder into the cervix, which causes more stimulation to hypothalamus, which causes more oxytocin to be produced until the baby is expelled. And then the oxytocin is turned off. And like I said, blood clotting is the same way. You have this cascading mechanism to perform a clot that has to be rapid and feed forward. And immune response also is also, you have to do something quickly to fight this invader. And then once it's over, you turn it off. So it's important to really know negative feedback mechanisms, positive also, but mostly negative, because we'll be talking about negative feedback mechanisms for all this semester and the next semester. You just can't get away from it. That's the major way things are regulated in the human body, by negative feedback mechanisms. Now, disease is a breakdown of homeostasis. That's so remember, homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal environment, If you let these homeostatic variables get too far out of whack, you end up with disease, right? So body temperature is way too high, that's a fever. If body temperature is way too low, it's hypothermia. So that's, and you can think of, well, fever is certainly a disease, but hypothermia could be considered a disease. So that's, now, we'll be talking occasionally here or there about diseases, but one thing I gotta warn you about diseases on exams and stuff. Usually on exams and other assessments, I'm looking for normal physiology. Don't immediately think it's some kind of disease state I'm talking about. I want normal physiology, unless the question specifically mentions a disease state. And then that's a disease question. But all other questions, unless they specifically mention a disease state, because lots of students want to go in there and throw in when something goes wrong. Well, first we got to know what goes right. And that's the important part. And then we can worry about maybe when certain things go well. Okay? So keep that in mind. And I think that is the end of 203 Human 2, and I'll put it up on YouTube and make it available. So right now, we're going to stop recording, and again, see you in the next video, the next chapter.